It was a cool gray morning in Shaker Heights, the kind that gently lulls a quiet suburb to life. Dew clung to the grass, the streets dotted with early risers walking their dogs or grabbing their first cup of Starbucks for the day. But on this particular morning, something far more sinister stirred beneath the serene facade of this upper-middle-class neighborhood. Welcome to True Crime Sketches, where we peel back the layers of civility to reveal the shocking truths hiding in plain sight. Today we're taking you into the heart of Shaker Heights, Ohio, a community known for its charm, picturesque homes, and progressive ideals. It's a place that promises safety and tranquility, but like all illusions, sometimes reality hides in the shadows. In this quiet corner of the world, a deadly secret festered, one that would unravel a family and leave a woman dead. This is the tale of how a husband's twisted obsession shattered lives. Carol McMillan, a name that, to anyone who knew her, brought to mind warmth, kindness, and a sense of community. At 48, she was a pillar of her neighborhood, always flashing that signature friendly smile as she chatted with neighbors. She thrived in Shaker Heights, where the streets were lined with charming two-story homes, and people bonded over weekend barbecues and church events. It was on the surface the perfect place to live, and Carol, she embodied everything wholesome about it. Carol's home was a cozy refuge, a two-story house with family photos on every wall, the smell of freshly baked chocolate chip cookies often wafting through the air. Those cookies, oh, everyone knew about Carol's cookies. She brought them to work, shared them with neighbors. They were a little piece of joy she offered to the world. But not even the smell of cookies could mask the poison creeping into her life, lurking just beneath the surface. Her husband, Daniel McMillan, was 16 years younger, a health insurance professional who seemed to be the picture of a loving spouse. They had been married for 5 years, and while the age gap raised a few eyebrows, no one suspected anything truly amiss. Carol loved Daniel. She trusted him. She believed they were building a life together, filled with shared dreams and, of course, family. Living with them was Sarah Levinsky McMillan, Carol's 19-year-old daughter from a previous marriage. Bright, ambitious, with aspirations of becoming a doctor, Sarah was her mother's pride and joy. Carol supported her daughter with unwavering devotion, excited for Sarah's future and eager to see her dreams come true. They were a family intertwined by love, or so it seemed. In the days before her untimely death, Carol was brimming with excitement, planning a much-anticipated family vacation to Orlando. She'd already bought a new suitcase, filled it with summer clothes, sunscreen, and a fresh pair of sandals. She couldn't wait for the sun, the joy, the time together as a family, but that trip would never happen. April 17th, 2019, started like any other day in Shaker Heights. The neighborhood was slowly waking up, residents going about their routines. The sky was overcast, typical for spring in Ohio. By 8:30 a.m., Sarah descended the stairs, likely anticipating the familiar scent of breakfast or perhaps her mother bustling about the kitchen. But instead she found something that would shatter her world. Carol was lying on the kitchen floor, unresponsive. Her mother, who had been so full of life just the day before, was now silent, cold. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. This story is more than just a tale of murder. It's about obsession, betrayal, and the dark depths of human nature. Carol McMillan had no idea that behind Daniel's gentle facade lurked something far more sinister. His infatuation wasn't with his wife, it was with her daughter. And to make Sarah his, Daniel devised a plan so depraved that it defied comprehension. He poisoned Carol, slowly, methodically, all to rid himself of the one thing standing in the way of his twisted desire. As the investigation unfolded, the truth came out in harrowing detail. This wasn't just a crime. It was a betrayal of the deepest kind, a cold, calculated act driven by Daniel's selfish obsession. Carol's dreams of a happy life, her plans for that family vacation, her future, all of it stolen in an instant by the man she loved, the man she thought she could trust. So today, as we step back from the quiet streets of Shaker Heights and consider the tragedy that unfolded, we are reminded that sometimes the monsters wear familiar faces. They hide in plain sight, disguised as husbands, friends, neighbors, and sometimes the price of uncovering the truth is steep. But uncover it. We must. Beside Carol's lifeless body, a can of Diet Pepsi lay on its side, its contents slowly pooling on the kitchen floor, the sugary liquid creeping into the grout between the tiles. It was Carol's favorite drink, an American staple, ubiquitous in households across the country. But now, the familiar fizz and foam served as a stark contrast to the eerie stillness of the room. Sarah's mind was racing, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. Panic consumed her as she screamed, her voice cracking under the weight of the sudden horror. Fumbling with trembling hands, she dialed 911, her fingers slippery with sweat. The operator's voice on the other end was calm, professional, but it did little to soothe Sarah. She couldn't comprehend it, how just moments before everything had seemed so ordinary. Now her mother was gone, lying still on the floor. As she sobbed into the phone, she begged for help, the desperation in her voice cutting through the quiet chaos. Minutes later, the paramedics arrived, their sirens blaring down the once peaceful street. Sarah, still in shock, was pacing back and forth in the living room, her mind a blur of disbelief. The house, which had always been filled with the warmth of Carol's presence, now felt cold, almost empty. The only sound that echoed through the room was the distant murmur of the 911 operator still connected on Sarah's phone, forgotten on the kitchen counter. The paramedics moved quickly, checking Carol for any signs of life, but it was too late. There was nothing they could do. Carol McMillan was declared dead on the scene, her body lifeless in the very heart of the home she had so lovingly created. As the reality sank in, Sarah's world crumbled. Just yesterday, her mother had been so full of life, chattering excitedly about their upcoming vacation, picking out outfits and making plans for the future. Now that future had been ripped away, leaving Sarah drowning in a sea of grief. Amidst the chaos, Sarah managed to call Daniel, her stepfather, who was still at work. His reaction was instant, a wail so visceral that it seemed to cut through the very air. He screamed into the phone, his words barely coherent as he promised he would leave work immediately. The grief in his voice bordered on hysteria, blending with Sarah's sobs until the two of them sounded like echoes of the same broken heart. Meanwhile, the Shaker Heights Police Department had arrived at the McMillan residence. Leading the investigation was Detective Laura Robitek, a seasoned officer with over 15 years of experience. Known for her sharp instincts and methodical approach, Robitek had a reputation for solving even the most challenging cases. As she stepped into the McMillan home on the morning of April 17, 2019, her gut told her something was wrong, something that went beyond the obvious tragedy. The McMillan house was immaculate, like a snapshot of suburban perfection. The lawn outside was neatly trimmed, with a garden just beginning to bloom in the early spring. Inside, everything was in its place, the kitchen spotless, the living room perfectly arranged. Yet, amidst this picture-perfect setting, Carol McMillan's body lay crumpled on the kitchen floor, the spilled Diet Pepsi pooling beside her in an almost casual manner. As Detective Robitek and her team began their work, they wasted no time securing the crime scene. Yellow tape was quickly put up around the house, officers stationed at the entrances to keep curious neighbors at bay. The investigators methodically combed through the house, examining every detail. But it was strange. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle, nothing to indicate that anyone had broken in. Carol's purse was still on the counter, untouched, and the back door remained securely locked. It didn't make sense. A sudden death, no obvious cause, no clear signs of foul play. But Detective Robitek had been in the game long enough to know that the most dangerous secrets often lie just beneath the surface. The spilled soda, the untouched purse, the locked door, it all seemed too neat, too tidy. Something didn't add up, and Robitek's instincts told her that the truth was buried deep within this seemingly perfect suburban life. As the investigation deepened, every detail, no matter how small, took on new weight. There was more to this story, more than anyone could have guessed. Carol McMillan's death wasn't just a tragic accident. It was the result of a carefully crafted plan. A plan born out of obsession, jealousy, and the kind of twisted desires that, once set in motion, could not be stopped. And so, in the quiet town of Shaker Heights, where the streets were lined with manicured lawns and the air smelled of spring blooms, the investigation into Carol McMillan's death would soon uncover a dark, hidden world that no one could have imagined. From the moment Detective Robitek noticed the half-full can of Diet Pepsi, her mind began to churn with possibilities. The can, still mostly intact despite the small spill, didn't seem like a casual detail anymore. There was something about its placement, so innocent, yet so potentially telling. She instructed the crime scene unit to collect it immediately, along with samples of the soda and anything nearby that might hold a clue to what had truly happened. Every inch of the kitchen was documented. Photos were taken from every angle, the countertop swabbed, and the floor tiles inspected for any unusual substances that might point to something darker. An autopsy was quickly ordered. Initial guesses by the paramedics leaned toward a heart attack, a sudden tragic end to an otherwise happy life. But Robitek's gut told her differently. Carol's body position, the eerily casual appearance of the half-drunk soda, the way the scene seemed too tidy, it all gnawed at the back of her mind. Carol had been drinking her favorite soda when she died, something she enjoyed regularly, yet that very familiarity felt like a red flag to Robotech. It was too perfect, as if someone had set the stage. With these thoughts circling her mind, Detective Robotech's team began their methodical search for more clues. They combed through the house, moving with the precision of surgeons, scrutinizing Carol's personal belongings, and gathering everything that might shed light on what had happened that morning. Carol's phone was taken into evidence. The detectives would later dive into her calls and messages, hoping to piece together the final moments of her life. It was becoming clear that this case would require more than just routine police work. Every step forward revealed the potential for a deeper, more complicated truth hiding beneath the surface. Carol's death was no longer just a tragedy, it was a puzzle. And every puzzle has pieces. Now the detectives needed to figure out where those pieces fit. The focus of the investigation quickly shifted to those closest to Carol. After all, in cases like these, the danger often lurked within the family, behind closed doors. First on the list was Carol's much younger husband, Daniel McMillan. At 32, Daniel had crafted a picture-perfect life for himself. He worked at a health insurance company in Cleveland, had a stable job, a beautiful home, and from all outward appearances, a happy family. He was charming, handsome, and successful, a man who seemed to have it all. But as the detectives dug deeper, cracks began to show. Daniel and Carol had met 6 years earlier, a whirlwind romance between a young, ambitious insurance analyst and a woman who, though widowed, had found herself drawn to his youthful energy. They married just a year after meeting, and Daniel stepped into the role of stepfather to Sarah, who was only 13 at the time. To everyone around them, their relationship seemed solid, a May-December romance that just worked. But the more the detectives uncovered, the clearer it became that all wasn't as perfect as it appeared. Friends of the couple had noticed subtle changes in Daniel over the past year. He had grown more distant, more absorbed in his work, spending longer hours at the office or claiming he had to travel for business. He had once been the picture of a doting husband, but recently his affection toward Carol seemed to have cooled. It was as though something, or someone, had shifted his focus away from her. These observations piqued the detectives' interest, but they were only the beginning of a much deeper dive into Daniel's life. When the police brought Daniel in for questioning, his demeanor raised even more questions. He appeared calm, too calm, some would say, considering the circumstances. His shock at Carol's death was present but muted, as though he was disconnected from the emotion of it all. During the interview, Daniel stated that he had been at work when the tragedy unfolded and had rushed home the moment Sarah called him. His voice was steady as he explained the timeline, never faltering, never letting emotion creep too far into his words. When Detective Robotech pressed him about his marriage to Carol, Daniel admitted that they had grown apart over time, but insisted that they still had a good relationship. He was quick to paint their life together as comfortable, though not particularly passionate in recent years. He denied any involvement in her death, and when asked why anyone would want to harm her, Daniel seemed genuinely puzzled. "I don't know why," he repeated softly, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes avoiding Robotech's sharp gaze. But as cool and collected as Daniel seemed, Detective Robotech's instincts told her something was wrong. People don't just die suddenly and mysteriously, especially not in the middle of an ordinary morning, sipping on their favorite soda. The investigation was only just beginning, but already it was clear that Daniel McMillan was hiding something. Whether it was his own guilt or someone else's, the detectives were determined to uncover the truth. And beneath, Sarah was visibly distressed, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen from days of crying. The weight of her mother's death seemed to press heavily on her shoulders, and Robotech could sense the depth of her grief. But even amidst the obvious pain, there were questions that needed answers. The detectives had to remain objective. Emotion could blur the facts, and with a case this complex, every detail mattered. Sarah explained that on the morning of her mother's death, she had been upstairs, buried in her textbooks, preparing for an upcoming biology exam. Her focus had been intense, the looming test occupying her mind. It was only when she felt a sudden urge to stretch and grab a snack that she wandered downstairs. What she discovered in the kitchen, however, was nothing short of a nightmare. Her mother, Carol, lying on the floor unresponsive. The half-empty can of Diet Pepsi beside her. Robotech noted how Sarah described the scene, her voice breaking as she recounted the moment she realized something was terribly wrong. The horror in her tone felt genuine, the kind of shock that sticks in a person's throat, suffocating any semblance of calm. She had tried to wake her mother, calling out to her, but there had been no response. In her panic, Sarah had dialed 911, her fingers fumbling as she pleaded for help. It was an image Robotech could picture clearly, desperation thick in the air. The kitchen eerily still except for the ticking of the clock and the distant sound of the operator's voice. Yet even in the midst of Sarah's heartbreak, the detectives knew they had to dig deeper. With Daniel's unsettling obsession with Sarah now out in the open, there was a new layer of complexity to the investigation. Was Sarah merely a victim, caught in the web of her stepfather's twisted desires? Or was there more beneath the surface, something that hadn't yet been revealed? Detective Robotech had been in this line of work long enough to know that people weren't always what they seemed. The detectives began to probe gently into Sarah's relationship with Daniel, treading carefully given the sensitivity of the topic. At first, Sarah seemed confused by the line of questioning, but as they pressed on, her expression shifted. Moments of discomfort flickered across her face. She recounted how, over the years, Daniel had gone from being the charming, youthful man her mother had fallen for, to someone increasingly distant, secretive. He'd grown colder toward Carol, spending longer hours away from home, offering little in the way of explanation. But as the conversation deepened, more unsettling memories surfaced. Sarah hesitated before revealing how Daniel's attention toward her had always felt odd. She described moments when he'd linger too long in a room after her mother had left, or when his compliments about her appearance seemed just a little too personal. There were times when he would touch her shoulder or brush past her in a way that felt wrong, but she had dismissed these instances, convincing herself that she was overreacting. Now, in light of the investigation, those moments felt more sinister. Robotech and her team were careful not to push Sarah too hard, but the picture they were beginning to piece together was one of obsession, manipulation, and control. If Daniel's fixation on Sarah had grown beyond what was appropriate, it could explain why he might see Carol as an obstacle, someone who needed to be removed to clear the path for his desires. But even with this emerging theory, the detectives knew they couldn't jump to conclusions. They needed solid evidence, not just suspicion. The investigation into Daniel's life continued, uncovering more disturbing details about his growing disinterest in his wife and his increasingly unhealthy obsession with Sarah. Financial records were pulled, phone records were scrutinized, and emails were combed through in search of any evidence that might link him directly to Carol's death. But so far, everything seemed circumstantial. The key was the autopsy. Detective Robotech knew that if any poison or foreign substance had been found in Carol's system, the case against Daniel would strengthen significantly. As for Sarah, the detectives remained cautious. She had been through a traumatic ordeal, and while there was no direct evidence to suggest her involvement in her mother's death, Robotech couldn't ignore the possibility that Daniel's influence on her could have been deeper than anyone realized. If Daniel had manipulated Sarah, pulling her into his dark world without her even knowing, it would explain much. But if Sarah had been complicit in any way, it would unravel everything they thought they knew. In the days that followed, the police continued to build their case, awaiting the results from the lab, where the contents of the Diet Pepsi can and other samples from the crime scene were being tested. Detective Robotech felt the pressure mounting. The truth was close, she could feel it. But the closer they got, the more twisted and complex the story became. Would Daniel's secret obsession with his stepdaughter be enough to convict him? Would Sarah's memories of inappropriate behavior tip the scales in their favor? And most importantly, what had really happened that morning in the McMillan kitchen? As the investigation unfolded, the detectives knew one thing for certain. The darkness they were uncovering went far deeper than they had initially imagined. And in the quiet streets of Shaker Heights, the facade of normalcy was beginning to crack, revealing the horrifying truth beneath. At first, Jessica had justified the affair to herself, telling herself that Daniel's marriage with Carol seemed distant, even cold. But over time, she had become tangled in a web of guilt, trapped between her love for her best friend and the passionate affair she couldn't walk away from. As the police pressed her for details, it became clear that Jessica was torn. Her voice wavered as she spoke, her hands fidgeting nervously in her lap. Jessica admitted that Daniel had confided in her about his growing frustration with Carol. He complained that Carol was too focused on her daughter Sarah, and that he felt neglected. He had painted a picture of a marriage slowly unraveling, though Jessica now realized much of what Daniel had said could have been manipulative, an attempt to justify his wandering eyes and hands. The revelation of the affair cracked open another layer of the investigation, adding a new possible motive to the already tangled case. Could Jessica, blinded by her affair with Daniel, have played a role in Carol's death? Or was she merely another pawn in Daniel's twisted game, much like Sarah? The detectives found it hard to ignore the timing of the affair. just a year before Carol's death. Could this illicit relationship have pushed Daniel over the edge? They grilled Jessica further, trying to find out if Daniel had ever mentioned wanting to leave Carol or, worse, if he had ever hinted at wanting her gone for good. Jessica denied any knowledge of such plans, but her guilt was clear. She confessed that she had broken off the affair just a few weeks before Carol's death, overwhelmed by the deceit and her love for Carol. Daniel had not taken the breakup well, according to Jessica. He had grown distant, his mood turning dark and unpredictable. Detective Robitek's suspicions intensified. Daniel's growing obsession with Sarah, his failing marriage with Carol, and now the affair with Jessica. It was a perfect storm of motives, each more twisted than the last. But despite the emotional turmoil Jessica's confession caused, there was still no concrete evidence linking her to the crime. Like Sarah, Jessica's alibi checked out. On the day of Carol's death, she had been at a real estate open house miles away. There was no indication she had any direct involvement. Still, the detectives couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, pieces of the puzzle that hadn't yet been revealed. Jessica's confession also put a new light on Daniel's character. Not only was he harboring a secret obsession with his stepdaughter, but he had also been lying to both Carol and her closest friend. It raised questions about just how far Daniel was willing to go to get what he wanted. As the police continued their investigation, they focused more heavily on Daniel. His obsession with Sarah, his affair with Jessica, and his cold, calculated demeanor in the wake of his wife's death all pointed toward a man hiding something. But they needed evidence, something more than just his suspicious behavior and Jessica's revelations. The forensic team was still waiting for the results from the lab, hoping that the Diet Pepsi can would provide the answers they needed. In the meantime, Detective Robitek and her team began to piece together a more detailed timeline of Daniel's movements in the days leading up to Carol's death. They scoured phone records, credit card transactions, and surveillance footage from nearby stores, searching for any sign that Daniel had been planning something. His alibi, that he had been at work, was solid, but there were gaps in his timeline that raised eyebrows. As the investigation deepened, the detectives discovered that Daniel had taken out a substantial life insurance policy on Carol just 6 months before her death. The payout would have been enough to cover all of his financial needs for years, and perhaps even more disturbing, enough to potentially start a new life with Sarah, free from the burdens of his marriage. This discovery changed everything. Suddenly, the detectives had a financial motive to add to Daniel's growing list of dark secrets. Could Daniel have planned Carol's death to not only remove the obstacle of his wife, but also to secure a financial windfall that would allow him to pursue his obsession with Sarah? The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but the detectives knew they were still missing a few key elements. And so, as they waited for the lab results and continued to dig through Daniel's life, the shadow of his guilt grew darker, stretching over everyone involved. Sarah remained a victim in their eyes, unaware of the depths of her stepfather's desires. Jessica, too, seemed more like a pawn in a much larger scheme, caught in the middle of Daniel's manipulations. But as the tension mounted, one thing was becoming increasingly clear. Daniel McMillan was at the center of this twisted web, and the detectives were closing in, ready to unravel the final threads of this tragic and chilling story. Carol had meticulously planned her death, and the introduction of cyanide into her Diet Pepsi was not just a random act, but a cold, calculated murder. The discovery of cyanide immediately narrowed down the suspect list to those who had access to Carol's home and personal life. This revelation painted a far more sinister picture of the events leading up to her death. Detective Robitek knew that cyanide wasn't something one could easily get their hands on. It required knowledge, access, and intent. Whoever had done this had not only wanted Carol dead, but had also chosen a method that was both quick and undetectable at first glance. The investigation shifted from a possible accident to a hunt for a killer with a motive, and that motive, more than ever, seemed to circle back to Daniel McMillan. With the toxicology report confirming Carol's murder, Robitek and her team zeroed in on Daniel. His behavior, the affair with Jessica, and his obsession with Sarah now carried even more weight. Was he the mastermind behind this brutal act? Or was there someone else who had been pushed over the edge by jealousy or heartbreak? The detectives revisited their interviews, particularly with Jessica. During her earlier questioning, she had mentioned that Daniel had recently confessed to being in love with someone else. At the time, she suspected it might be Sarah, though she wasn't sure. The detectives couldn't ignore the possibility that Jessica's jealousy over losing Daniel to another woman, possibly someone as young and vibrant as Sarah, could have fueled her rage. Could she have been the one to poison Carol, driven by a complex mix of guilt, love, and rejection. But then again, Daniel's financial motives were impossible to overlook. His recently obtained life insurance policy on Carol and his overall dissatisfaction with their marriage presented another clear reason why he might have wanted her out of the way. The police began pulling together the last pieces of evidence, reviewing Daniel's movements in the weeks leading up to Carol's death, as well as any purchases or online activity that could point toward cyanide procurement. Jessica, despite her airtight alibi, remained a person of interest. Her nervousness during the interview, the admission of her affair, and the way she had described her feelings for Daniel all contributed to an ongoing suspicion. Could she have acted on impulse driven by jealousy and heartbreak, poisoning her best friend in an act of desperation? With the discovery of cyanide, the focus on how the poison was acquired became a key element of the investigation. Detective Robotech sent her team to comb through local chemical suppliers, online orders, and any potential avenues through which the poison could have been purchased or stolen. It was clear now that Carol's death wasn't just a tragic accident or an act of passion. It was premeditated, and every detail had been carefully orchestrated. As the police honed in on Daniel, they uncovered even more troubling information. He had recently made multiple online searches for cyanide, disguised under the guise of research. The timeline of his searches lined up eerily close to the time of Carol's death. But it wasn't just the online evidence that put him under more scrutiny. Phone records showed that he had made a series of unexplained calls, including one to a chemical supplier outside of Ohio. While the connection between the calls and the poison wasn't entirely clear yet, it was enough to make Daniel the prime suspect. However, Daniel remained elusive. In interviews, he remained composed, never straying far from his story. He insisted he loved Carol, even though they had grown distant, and continued to deny any involvement in her death. He explained away the life insurance policy as a necessary precaution for their future, and he claimed ignorance when it came to the cyanide poisoning. His calm demeanor, however, only served to make the detectives more suspicious. It was as if he had rehearsed his answers, carefully constructing a narrative that seemed just a little too perfect. As the pieces of the puzzle slowly fell into place, Detective Robotech felt the weight of the case bearing down on her. There were still gaps, still questions that needed answering. The motive seemed clear. Daniel had wanted Carol out of the way, possibly to pursue his obsession with Sarah, possibly for financial gain, or both. But proving it in court would require more than just speculation. In the days following the cyanide revelation, the investigators received another crucial lead. A witness had come forward, an employee from a chemical supplier in a neighboring state, who remembered a phone call from someone asking suspiciously specific questions about cyanide. The description of the caller's voice matched Daniel's, though it wasn't definitive. The detectives hoped this would be the break they needed, something that would finally tie Daniel to the crime. As they built their case, the detectives couldn't help but wonder how far Daniel was willing to go to cover his tracks. His calm exterior, his rehearsed answers, his tangled relationships with both Sarah and Jessica, each element painted the picture of a man capable of great deceit. But could he really have murdered his wife in such a cold and calculating way? By the end of April, the investigation was nearing its climax. The police had compiled a mountain of circumstantial evidence pointing toward Daniel, but they still needed a direct link. They were close, so close to exposing the truth behind Carol McMillan's murder. And as the detectives prepared to make their next move, they knew one thing for certain. In this web of lies, deceit, and obsession, the truth would come out. It was only a matter of time before the killer slipped. As the detectives honed in on the investigation, they focused their efforts on how the cyanide had been introduced into Carol's drink. The forensic discovery of traces of cyanide on the rim of the Diet Pepsi can was the break they needed. It confirmed that the poisoning had been deliberate, but it also raised more chilling questions. Who had access to cyanide? How had it been slipped into Carol's drink without her noticing? And most importantly, why? Revisiting the crime scene, the detectives meticulously searched for any further clues, retracing every step that Carol might have taken that day. They questioned everyone who had been close to her in the days leading up to her death. Daniel's behavior, which had already been suspicious, now seemed all the more significant. His cold detachment and vague statements about his relationship with Carol painted a troubling picture, especially in light of his secret obsession with Sarah. The forensic team also looked into the backgrounds of all the suspects, searching for any history of chemical knowledge or access to poisons. Online purchases and searches were scrutinized, and phone records were pulled. It quickly became clear that the cyanide used to kill. Whoever had done this had thought it through and acted with terrifying precision. As the detectives re-interviewed the suspects, they applied more pressure, trying to break through the layers of deception. Daniel in particular found himself under increasing scrutiny. His attempts to remain calm seemed strained, his story inconsistent, and with each question, his mask of composure began to slip. The breakthrough came on April 20th, 2019, just before noon. After meticulously examining all the evidence and cross-referencing the suspect's statements, the police were finally able to piece together a disturbing narrative that pointed directly at Daniel McMillan. On the surface, Daniel appeared to be everything Shaker Heights celebrated, a young, successful professional living the perfect suburban life. But behind that carefully crafted facade lurked a man consumed by twisted desires and dark motives. His obsession with Sarah, his 19-year-old stepdaughter, had been growing for some time. To the outside world, he was a doting husband and a supportive father figure. In reality, he saw Carol, his wife, as an obstacle to the disturbing fantasy he had built in his mind. Daniel had begun to fantasize about a new life, a life where Carol no longer existed and where he could pursue Sarah without restraint. The detectives uncovered that in the months leading up to Carol's death, Daniel had grown distant, both emotionally and physically. His affair with Jessica, Carol's best friend, had been a distraction, but it was never the real prize. Jessica was simply a way to pass the time while Daniel's obsession with Sarah deepened. As the police delved deeper into Daniel's actions, they uncovered chilling evidence. Internet searches on his devices revealed he had been researching cyanide, looking for ways to obtain it and how it could be used in poisoning. Phone records showed calls to suppliers of dangerous chemicals, and bank statements hinted at unusual transactions that could be tied to the procurement of the poison. All of this pointed to one terrifying conclusion. Daniel had planned Carol's death for months, calculating every step with cold precision. It became clear that on the morning of Carol's death, Daniel had waited for the perfect opportunity to slip the cyanide into her drink. The half-empty can of Diet Pepsi had been laced with the deadly substance, and Carol had unknowingly ingested it, sealing her fate. Daniel had likely watched her, waiting for the poison to take effect, knowing that soon his wife would be gone. But Daniel's twisted plan didn't end with Carol's death. The detectives believed that Daniel had fully intended to manipulate Sarah into a relationship with him, now that Carol was out of the way. His obsession had clouded his judgment, leading him to believe that with Carol gone, Sarah would come to him willingly, unaware of his true motives. As the full scope of Daniel's betrayal came to light, the police confronted him with the evidence. His demeanor shifted, the confident facade he had worn during previous interviews finally cracking under the weight of the truth. He denied everything at first, but the overwhelming proof of his guilt left him with no room to maneuver. Daniel McMillan had orchestrated his wife's murder. Driven by a perverse obsession with her daughter, and his carefully constructed world was beginning to crumble around him. The detectives moved quickly to arrest Daniel, charging him with first-degree murder. The revelation sent shockwaves through Shaker Heights, a community that prided itself on its progressive values and tight-knit relationships. But behind the polished exteriors, Daniel had harbored dark secrets, and now the truth had been exposed for all to see. As Daniel was led away in handcuffs, the investigation continued, with the police carefully combing through every remaining detail to ensure that justice for Carol McMillan would be served. Sarah, the innocent young woman caught in the middle of this nightmare, was left to grapple with the horrifying realization that her stepfather had killed her mother, all in the hopes of pursuing his twisted desires. The case of Carol McMillan's murder was one that would haunt Shaker Heights for years to come. A reminder that even in the most idyllic of settings, darkness can lurk beneath the surface. And the truth, when finally uncovered, can be more chilling than anyone ever imagined. The courtroom was packed on the morning of January 15, 2019, as Daniel McMillan's trial began in Cuyahoga County Court of Common Pleas. The case had rocked Shaker Heights, and the community was eager to see justice for Carol McMillan. The image of Daniel, the charming, well-liked man standing trial for the murder of his wife, seemed surreal to those who had once considered him a friend, a devoted husband, and a father figure. Now, the dark truth had come to light. Daniel had carefully and coldly orchestrated Carol's death, driven by an obsession with her daughter, Sarah. Assistant District Attorney James Leakey took to the stand with the poise and precision of someone who had meticulously built a case brick by brick. Leakey was known for his determined approach and sharp legal mind, and he wasted no time in laying out the damning evidence against Daniel. His voice echoed through the courtroom as he described how Daniel had spent months researching cyanide, searching for the poison, and planning the murder down to the smallest detail. Leakey walked the jury through the timeline, showing how Daniel had used Carol's daily habits, her love for Diet Pepsi, against her. The prosecution painted Daniel as a man consumed by his twisted desires, who saw Carol as nothing more than an obstacle in his path to Sarah. Leakey emphasized how Daniel's internet searches on cyanide, coupled with the forensic evidence from the Diet Pepsi can, showed the premeditated nature of the crime. The jury was shown records of Daniel's internet activity, search terms like how to buy cyanide, cyanide effects on the body, and undetectable poisons. These searches, conducted months before Carol's death, left little doubt in anyone's mind that this was not an impulsive act. It was murder in the most calculated sense. Leakey didn't stop there. He called witnesses to the stand, including forensic experts who had found traces of cyanide on the rim of Carol's drink and inside her system. He brought in Carol's friends, who described how Carol had been happy, content, and completely unaware of the danger lurking in her own home. The evidence was overwhelming. Each piece fell into place, painting Daniel not as a man overwhelmed by stress, but as a cold, methodical killer. The tension in the courtroom grew as the prosecution delved into Daniel's personal life, revealing the depth of his obsession with Sarah. They showed how Daniel's distance from Carol had been deliberate, how he had manipulated both her and those around them to maintain the facade of a loving husband while secretly lusting after her daughter. It was a devastating portrayal of a man who had lost any sense of morality in his pursuit of his twisted desires. But defense attorney Laura Phillips had a different narrative to sell to the jury. Standing tall and composed, she tried to portray Daniel as a man who had buckled under the weight of personal and financial stress, a man whose judgment had been clouded by external pressures and perhaps even mental instability. Phillips argued that while Daniel's behavior may have been suspicious, there wasn't enough direct evidence linking him to the cyanide poisoning. She claimed that the prosecution's case was built on circumstantial evidence and stressed that Daniel had no prior history of violence or criminal intent. Phillips did her best to poke holes in the prosecution's case, questioning the reliability of the forensic evidence and suggesting that someone else, perhaps even Jessica Miller, the woman with whom Daniel had been having an affair, might have been involved. She argued that Daniel's internet searches on cyanide could have been mere curiosity, not intent, and that there was no direct proof that he had been the one to mix the poison into Carol's drink. But despite Phillips' best efforts, her defense faltered under the weight of the evidence. Leakey countered each of her points with precision, re-emphasizing that the traces of cyanide on the Diet Pepsi can directly link Daniel to the crime. The meticulous planning, the timing of Carol's death, and Daniel's twisted fixation on Sarah all pointed to one inescapable conclusion. Daniel McMillan had carefully, coldly murdered his wife. The trial was grueling, stretching over weeks as the prosecution and defense traded arguments, each trying to sway the jury. But the longer the trial went on, the more damning the evidence against Daniel became. Witness after witness described the perfect storm of motives: a failing marriage, an obsession with his stepdaughter, financial gain from Carol's life insurance. It all led back to Daniel. On February 3, 2019, after days of deliberation, the jury finally returned with a verdict. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the foreman stood to deliver the decision: guilty. Daniel McMillan was convicted of first-degree murder. The sentencing was swift. Given the premeditated nature of the crime and the overwhelming evidence, Daniel was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The Shaker Heights community, still reeling from the trial, was left to grapple with the horrifying reality that a man they had once admired had committed such a brutal and calculated crime. For Sarah, the trial's conclusion brought little closure. She was left with the devastating knowledge that the man she had once trusted as a father figure had murdered her mother in cold blood, all while harboring an unhealthy obsession with her. The betrayal was too deep, the scars too fresh. In the weeks following the trial, she withdrew from public life, struggling to come to terms with the nightmare she had lived through. As Daniel McMillan was led away in handcuffs, the case of Carol McMillan's murder came to a close. But the haunting questions it raised about the darkness that can hide beneath the surface of seemingly perfect lives remained unanswered. Shaker Heights would never be the same. The neighborhood of Shaker Heights, though outwardly returning to its quiet, peaceful routine, carried the silent weight of the tragedy that had unfolded in one of its seemingly perfect homes. Carol's death and the subsequent trial had left deep scars, not just on her family but on the entire community. Sarah Linsky McMillan, once a vibrant and ambitious pre-med student, faced an uncertain future. The bright young woman who had once dreamed of becoming a doctor now found herself grappling with the emotional devastation of her mother's murder and the betrayal by the man she had trusted as a father figure. The break from school allowed her to focus on healing, but the path forward was difficult. Every memory of her mother was now stained by the knowledge of Daniel's dark intentions. Despite the support of friends and family, Sarah struggled with the dual grief of losing both her mother and the man she thought she could trust. Counselors helped Sarah navigate her trauma, offering her tools to cope with the complex emotions she was feeling: anger, sadness, confusion, and the overwhelming sense of betrayal. She spent time away from Shaker Heights, distancing herself from the place that had become a constant reminder of the nightmare she had lived through. With the love and support of those closest to her, Sarah slowly began to rebuild her life. She returned to school after a year-long hiatus, determined to honor her mother's memory by continuing the path they had once dreamed of together. Jessica Miller, Carol's former close friend, found herself in a very different position. Though exonerated of any involvement in the murder, her affair with Daniel had become public knowledge, making her the subject of scandal and whispers in the tight-knit community. Shunned by former clients and friends alike, Jessica's once thriving real estate business began to falter. The fallout from her role in the affair, combined with the stigma of being associated with such a horrific crime, forced Jessica to make a difficult decision. She left Shaker Heights, moving to another city in an attempt to start over. Jessica sought anonymity, a chance to rebuild her life and career far away from the judgment and gossip that now followed her. But despite the passage of time, the shadows of the case lingered. Carol's friends continued to gather in her memory, organizing community events and church functions in her honor. They worked tirelessly to keep her spirit alive through acts of kindness and community service, hoping to fill the void left by her absence. Carol had been a beacon of warmth and compassion, and those who had known her felt a responsibility to carry that light forward, even in the face of such a tragic loss. For the residents of Shaker Heights, the McMillan murder became a painful reminder that darkness can hide beneath the most idyllic surfaces. The case had shattered the illusion of safety and perfection in their quiet suburb, leaving a sense of unease that would take years to fully dissipate. Yet amid the lingering grief and the memories of what had been lost, there was also a sense of resilience. The community had weathered the storm together, and though they would never forget the tragedy, they were determined to move forward. Daniel McMillan, now serving his life sentence in the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction, became a figure of infamy within the prison system. His fall from grace, from a successful, well-liked man in Shaker Heights to a convicted murderer, was documented by local media outlets. Reports occasionally surfaced about his adjustment to prison life, but the public interest in his case gradually waned. He had become just another name in a long list of men whose greed, lust, and obsessions had led them to commit unimaginable acts. In the end, Daniel's conviction brought a measure of closure to the case, but the emotional scars he left behind would remain with those involved for a lifetime. For Sarah, Jessica, and the Shaker Heights community, healing was a slow and ongoing process. As the years passed, they learned to live with the memories of the past, even as they worked to create new ones. Memories untainted by tragedy, built on the love and resilience that Carol McMillan had embodied throughout her life. Though justice had been served in the eyes of the law, the true impact of Carol's death would be felt for generations, a reminder that even in the most perfect of places, darkness can find its way in. But through the pain, the strength of those left behind continued to shine, proving that love and community could, in time, overcome even the darkest of days. Isolated from the world, Daniel McMillan became just another inmate, his name only remembered for the terrible crime he had committed. The media's attention, once fixated on the trial and the scandal that had shocked Shaker Heights, slowly drifted away. Over time, Daniel's story faded from the headlines, leaving him to live out his remaining days in the shadows of his own actions. Yet even as Daniel faded from public memory, the impact of his crime lingered. The once peaceful community of Shaker Heights, though resilient, had been forever changed by the events surrounding Carol McMillan's murder. The story served as a reminder that darkness can lurk even in the most idyllic of places, and that no one is immune to the forces of betrayal and violence. Carol's family and friends worked hard to keep her memory alive in ways that reflected the kind, compassionate woman she had been. The Carol McMillan Foundation became a powerful force in the community, helping underprivileged children and families through scholarships, educational programs, and social services. Carol's legacy of generosity and warmth lived on through the foundation, and many saw its impact as a beacon of hope and healing in the aftermath of such a brutal tragedy. Sarah Linsky McMillan, Carol's daughter, became the heart of that legacy. Though the trauma of her mother's death had left deep emotional wounds, Sarah was determined to rise above the darkness. She often reflected on how proud her mother would have been of the Foundation's work and her own resilience in the face of unimaginable grief. Returning to Case Western Reserve University, Sarah found solace in her studies and a renewed sense of purpose. Each day brought its challenges, but she pressed on, determined to fulfill her mother's dream of seeing her become a doctor. Sarah's journey wasn't just about personal achievement, though. In the years following the trial, she became a strong advocate for mental health awareness and trauma recovery, using her story as a way to encourage others to seek help in difficult times. She spoke openly at community events, sharing her experience of loss, betrayal, and the process of healing. Her bravery and openness touched many, and her willingness to confront her pain publicly became a source of inspiration for others in similar situations. Sarah's talks often revolved around the idea that healing doesn't come in a straight line. She spoke of setbacks, of moments when the grief felt too heavy to bear, but also of the support she found in her friends, family, and community. Her advocacy for mental health, paired with the work of the Carol McMillan Foundation, became a testament to the idea that even in the aftermath of tragedy, something good could emerge. Shaker Heights, while forever marked by the crime, began to find a new sense of normalcy in the years that followed. The town's residents, many of whom had known Carol personally or had been touched by her kindness, rallied around the foundation, volunteering their time and resources to help those in need. In many ways, the foundation became a unifying force, a way for the community to channel its grief into something constructive and positive. Meanwhile, Jessica Miller, Carol's former friend and Daniel's secret lover, continued to rebuild her life in another city. Though she had been exonerated of any involvement in the murder, the affair had left a permanent stain on her reputation in Shaker Heights. Starting over was difficult, but Jessica found a way to rebuild her career in real estate, quietly distancing herself from the events that had once consumed her life. She rarely spoke of what had happened, choosing instead to focus on moving forward and leaving the past behind. Though her role in the affair remained a controversial topic, Jessica managed to carve out a new life for herself, far from the shadows of Shaker Heights. For those left behind, Sarah, Carol's friends, and the community, the years ahead were about healing and finding ways to honor Carol's memory. The Carol McMillan Foundation became not just a tribute to a lost loved one, but a symbol of resilience, hope, and the enduring power of community. Though the events surrounding Carol's death would never be forgotten, they also served as a reminder of how, even in the face of tragedy, people can come together to create something positive. For Shaker Heights, the foundation was more than just a charitable organization. It was a way to heal, to rebuild, and to ensure that Carol's legacy of kindness and generosity would continue to touch lives for generations to come. The story of Carol McMillan's murder, which had once captivated the public during the trial, gradually faded into the background, becoming just another tragic chapter in the history of Shaker Heights. Daniel McMillan, now living out a life sentence in prison, faced days of monotony and regret. His choices had not only destroyed his own life but also left a trail of devastation among the people he had once claimed to love. Stripped of his former charm and status, Daniel's life behind bars became a haunting reminder of the irreversible consequences of his actions. Jessica Miller, who had made the difficult decision to leave Shaker Heights and rebuild her life in another city, found both relief and burden in her escape. While moving away allowed her to distance herself from the whispers and judgment that had followed her after the affair with Daniel and the subsequent trial, she couldn't fully outrun the emotional toll of the scandal. Jessica often grappled with feelings of guilt and shame, questioning her role in the series of events that led to Carol's death. To cope, she immersed herself in her work, throwing herself into her real estate career in the hopes that success might somehow redeem her. But no matter how far she went, the past lingered in her mind, a shadow she could not escape. The weight of her choices, both personal and professional, followed her into this new chapter of her life. Despite the geographical distance and the painful history between them, Jessica and Sarah Linsky McMillan maintained their bond. It was a relationship built on mutual loss, shared grief, and the understanding that they had both been deeply affected by Daniel's actions. Jessica, racked with remorse, was determined to be a steady source of support for Sarah, hoping to offer some stability in the young woman's life after such profound betrayal. Sarah, in turn, understood that while Jessica had played a part in the heartbreak, she had also been caught in the web of deception that Daniel had spun around them all. Their connection, though complex, became a lifeline for both women as they navigated their respective journeys toward healing. In the years that followed, Shaker Heights, though outwardly restored to its peaceful rhythms, never fully forgot the tragic events that had unfolded within its borders. The murder of Carol McMillan became a cautionary tale, whispered about in quiet conversations, a reminder that even the most perfect of communities could be shaken by the darker elements of human nature. The case left an indelible mark on the town's collective memory, serving as a symbol of how easily the veneer of idyllic suburban life could be cracked by greed, obsession, and betrayal. For Sarah, Jessica, and the rest of Carol's loved ones, life would never be the same. The loss of Carol had left a hole that could never be filled, but with time, they learned to live with the grief. The pain became a part of their lives, but so too did the resilience they had built in the face of such unimaginable adversity. Sarah, in particular, became a voice for perseverance, turning her pain into advocacy for mental health awareness and helping others navigate the complexities of grief and healing. Carol McMillan's life, though tragically cut short, continued to have a lasting impact on those who knew her. Her warmth, kindness, and dedication to her community became an enduring legacy. The Carol McMillan Foundation, established in her memory, grew each year, reaching more underprivileged families and children in need. The foundation's work became a beacon of hope for many, a way to ensure that Carol's spirit of generosity lived on. Through scholarships, community programs, and outreach efforts, the foundation made a tangible difference, continuing the work Carol had been so passionate about. For the residents of Shaker Heights, the town remained a place of beauty and close-knit community, but with a newfound awareness of life's complexities. The case had revealed the potential for both good and evil, for light and dark to coexist within the most unsuspecting places. It was a reminder that beneath even the most picturesque facades there could be secrets waiting to unravel. And yet, despite this awareness, Shaker Heights persevered. The community's strength lay not in its perfection, but in its ability to come together, to support one another through the most difficult times. In the years following Carol's death, the town worked to honor her memory, not by forgetting the tragedy that had occurred, but by continuing the work she had started. The Carol McMillan Foundation became a cornerstone of that effort, a living testament to the power of kindness, love, and resilience. As time passed, the story of Carol McMillan's life and the lessons learned from her death became woven into the fabric of Shaker Heights. The town, forever changed, moved forward with a deeper understanding of the complexities of human nature and the enduring capacity for both healing and hope.